Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. With such variability in grass growth and dairy cow diets, depending on where you're located in the country, Grass 10 advisor Joseph Dunphy gives tips and advice on feeding strategy depending on your situation as we move towards the final grazing rotation of the year. And Joseph speculates on September and October growth rates based on learnings from a similar drought event in 1995.
Just looking at some figures from pasture base last week, the average farm covers are coming in around 600 kilos of dry matter per hectare. The cover per cow is at 199. Stocking rate is in around 3 cows per hectare. A growth figure of 35. A demand of 33, and a diet on average at the minute of around 11 kilos of grass, 4 kilos of meal, and 2 kilos of silage. And I suppose, Emma-Louise, as most of your listeners know, there's huge variation around the country. I have three scenarios here really that I'm seeing. We've very low average farm covers, in particular the drier areas of the south and the east. The cows in these on these farms are pretty much on full silage and meal diets. Okay. Pretty much getting out to the paddocks really to lie down. The second scenario is in his farms that maybe holding maybe 20 to 30 kilos of growth at the minute, and they're probably, with 300 to 400 of an average farm cover, and they're on roughly maybe a 6 diet at the minute, Emma-Louise, maybe somewhere around 6 kilos of grass, 6 kilos of meal, and 6 kilos of silage, or some sort of an arrangement like that. And then probably the third scenario, Emma-Louise, is probably farms along the western seaboard or the BMW region of the country where have got adequate growth rates throughout July and early August there. So growth rates are somewhere in around 55 to 60. So in that scenario, they're probably grazing about 15 or 16 kilos of grass going in and 2 or 3 kilos of meal in those scenarios. So again, huge variation around the country, Emma-Louise, depending on the rainfall that has been received.
It's really interesting you say that, Joseph, because I met with a group of dairy farm management students last week, and you've referred to the scenarios and you can pinpoint it where the people are in the country. A chap from Cavan was talking about a diet of 17 kilos of grass and 1 kilo of concentrate. So, it's as per normal and as you would hope at this time of year. And then, a chap from Wexford talking about 14 kilos of silage and 4 kilos of concentrate. So exactly as you say it, a massive range. If we take a step into the scenario where there's, very little growth, you refer to the south and the east of the country, and that full silage and meal diet, I'm not sure, are we picking up the background noise, but I'm here in Moore Park and it's absolutely lashing rain today. Good rain over the weekend, much needed rain, but I suppose it's not going to make things recover overnight. So I suppose if you can draw on learnings from previous droughts for people in those locations, what are you seeing in terms of the recovery as the rain comes?
Yeah, so I think Emma-Louise, over the last weekend there, parts of the west probably received somewhere between 30 and 40 mil of rain, and then as you move further south, it was probably somewhere in the region of 15, 20 mil. Again, huge variation depending on location. But I suppose, where are we now? We're in early September. We've probably 2 rotations left on the farm, and I think in general from if we look to the last drought, farmers have fond memories of 2018 because we got the rainfall at the right time, and I think it's important to differentiate 2018 from this year. The rainfall arrived, early in August. And I suppose it arrived early in August, but we also got continuous rain. So we got 30 mil in late July, we got another 12 mil by mid-August, 25 mil in late August, another 25 mil in mid-September, and 40 mil on the 1st of October in Moore Park, for example. So We got constant rain throughout August, which helped to recover a lot of the farms, which culminated in a peak growth of 50 kilos of dry matter on the first of October from pasture-based figures. Okay, so I think everyone has a fond memory. We didn't grow over the average in terms of growth rate in 2018, but we just growth recovered, and we had an excellent back end because ground conditions were were excellent. For slightly older people, and I was only a couple of years old, Emma-Louise, when the drought in 1995 comes in, and some of my older colleagues, our older colleagues in Teagasc will remember it, but it's probably a little bit more similar to this year. Okay, and in 1995 there was 50 mil of rain received in late July. There was 7 mil in mid-August, and there was nothing then up until the 5th of September. And there was about 15 mil between the first and second week of September, pretty much like this. And there was nothing again for the remainder of September up until around the 1st of October, there was 15 mil. And in that year, Emma-Louise, the peak growth was 27 kilos in mid-October. Okay, so they didn't get the rain continuously throughout August, which then, growth rates were very, very low throughout September because of that. And that's nearly more of a scenario like this year as opposed to comparing to 2018.
It's a very interesting story, and it's funny that you're going back almost 30 years to find something comparable. I guess if we step away from that for a moment, Joe, and if we look at the ideal year, and you've referred to the BMW region and the Western Seaboard as having an ideal year, where should we be at right now in terms of the ideal farm cover and growth rate? We're heading towards mid-September now, and that peak in farm cover. What would we like to be seeing?
So if everything was going well all over the country, Emma-Louise, the mid-September targets again vary from the stocking rate. But if we look from a 2.5 cows to the hectare, you're aiming to be somewhere in around 350 of a cover per cow, which is around 900 to 1,000 of an average farm cover. At 3 livestock units per hectare, about 330, 340 per cow, again, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,100 of an average farm cover on your farm, and 3.5, again, somewhere between around 350 of a cover per cow, again, somewhere in around 1,100 of an average farm cover, if everything was going well. And I suppose a rotation length of around 30 days. So for a farm with 30 hectares, grazing roughly a hectare per day would be the targets.
So let's take those targets that you're talking about, and on average, pasture base is showing us we're well behind that target, but you have identified a couple of distinct scenarios. So for the farm who is at that good growth rate, a steady growth rate of the 50 to 60 kilos, grass is making up the predominant source of feed in the diet. What's their steps, as they head into, I suppose they're in the second last round now and heading into the final round. What's your advice there?
We're as you said, early September. I think nearly for all scenarios, we're probably looking at 2 30-day rotations from now on. Okay, so those people with plenty of grass on the farm, and again, I'm seeing strong enough growth rates somewhere between 55, 60-ish on those farms. The key thing is to keep walking those farms, keep an eye on growth rate, try and build to the peak of the 1,000, 1,100 into the second half of September. And then move on to, because when we look at it, Emma-Louise, we're probably really only 3 or 4 weeks away from closing our first paddock. So it's about hitting those targets, and those targets, okay, we can take the figure of 1,000, 1,100, but you're not going to get there unless you increase that rotation length out from your typical 21 days over the summer to the 30 days in September. That's the real driver. It's rotation length is the driver of building that peak cover on the farm.
If we then step into the position of the farm who is growing the 20 and 30 kilos, probably at the stage where they are grass, silage and meal in the diet as it stands. Again, you're talking about 2 30-day rounds. But I suppose looking to them, is there going to be a shift in the level of supplementation there, or will they continue with the high level of feeding from now until the end of the grazing season?
Yeah, so I think, we've received some rainfall and, badly needed rainfall in a lot of areas. And I think it's important that the feed stays in, even though I know when rain is received, farmers might be inclined to maybe let the handbrake down a bit and start grazing a little bit more. But, the key thing is to try and recover the average farm cover. Like, you're not going to get near the targets that we were talking about, but it's to recover the average farm cover to a reasonable level, to have grass on the farm throughout the autumn grazing period. So again, if we look at an example there, Emma-Louise, if we set the farm up for 2 30-day rounds now for September and October, and we take a 30-hectare farm with 90 cows, okay, so that's 1 hectare per day on average that they'll be grazing. And if that farm, say, is growing around 25 kilos of grass at the minute per hectare, and has a farm cover of somewhere in around 400 at the minute, their peak covers that the cows are probably going into are, they're probably somewhere around 900, Emma-Louise. So for every hectare they're getting, the 900 divided by 90, there's somewhere in around a maximum of 10 kilos of grass that can be allocated to those cows every day, and probably a little bit lower, depending on what level. So that's in a farm that's growing 25 at a farm cover of 400. There's going to be people in worse scenarios than that. So that's a scenario of 10 kilos of grass, 4 kilos of silage, and 4 kilos of meal. And by sticking to that 30-day round, we'll hope that with the bit of rainfall that we receive, that we will recover an average farm cover on that farm and try and build that up to 650, 700, some 750, and continue with that cover later on through the year. Like, I suppose the biggest thing is that we hope that we're wrong and we get more rain and we get more rainfall and the growth rates are strong. But I suppose the key thing is hope is not a strategy, and we just need to plan. So the 2 30-day rotations should help to build a farm cover.
And in that scenario, 10 kilos, it's over half of the diet. So they're still getting a good quality grazed grass source in the diet. You've spelled it out very well, Joe, that 400 kilos of a farm cover, you're talking 900 kilos of a pre-grazing herbage mass. And I suppose my question to you've kind of half answered it, but if you have 400 kilos of a farm cover now today, what is a realistic cover to be at closing?
Well, I think, Emma-Louise, we're all the time throughout the autumn we're thinking of the spring. And I know we're coming out of a drought this autumn, but still, really and truly, we shouldn't be changing anything in preparation for next spring. The key always is for October and November, when we're grazing, is to extend the rotation length as long as we can, but protect, close the farm correctly to have adequate covers on the farm for next spring. Okay, so if we can build back to that 650, 700, 750 on the farm and continue with it to keep grass in the diet throughout the back end, and then close our farm correctly and have, say, for instance, somewhere around 650, 700 on the farm on the 1st of December, where we're protecting, we have good grass on the farm, a good opening average farm cover of maybe somewhere, depending on your stocking rate, but somewhere between 900 and 1100 next spring. And I think, that should be where the plan is.
Finally then, Joe, the scenario where the cow is essentially going out to lie down. She's getting very little of her feed from grazed grass, predominantly grass silage and concentrate. Let's look for the next 2-3 months ahead on those farms. How are we feeding those cows?
We will, on some of those farms, Emma-Louise, farm cover will be very low. And again, it's just trying to aid that recovery. But by setting out a 30-day rotation on that farm, if that farm only has, say, 100 or 200 of an average farm cover on at the minute, splitting it into the 30-day round will help, and then continuing to measure the farm as growth rates recover throughout the back end. And as you start to build and reach reach some of the, reach maybe 500, 600 of an average farm cover as is recovering, you may be able to drop off some supplement as you go along. So you might be able to maybe get to maybe say 7 or 8 kilos. So like, maybe a half a day's grazing or something like that, and go back to maybe the 6, 6, and 6 or something like that to that extent. But in that scenario, and in some scenarios, I think people are going to have to get to terms with the fact that on a lot of these farms, silage will be in for the rest of the year. Okay, and that might be, and for every 100 cows, it could be a bale, 2.5 kilos a day. And that's where, Emma-Louise, I think it's going to be very important that a budget is done, a fodder budget is done. A lot of people had a month's silage spare, throughout the summer when the first set of fodder budgets were done. But I think and a lot of that silage on some of these drier farms, that bit of buffer that was there has now been ate or will be ate over the coming weeks. So it's essential that you look at what's in the yard and then look at some alternatives for the back end. And it's just a simple one there. As I was talking to a farmer this morning, he's going to be a little bit short on the silage point, and he had got some straw, and we were discussing the possibility of getting a contractor in twice a week over the dry period, just to mix some straw in with the silage. Just something practically. Doesn't have a diet feeder himself, but it was just something to stretch the winter feed. But he's making plans in early September, not later on in the winter when he's running out.
It's a really interesting point, Joseph, and from the perspective of farms, they had surplus, and now they're finding that they've potentially grazed their second round or their third round, as they might be putting into the pit, and they're also using the winter pit, which is really unfortunate and very frustrating for farmers. It's just a difficult year. You mentioned in some farms there's an average farm cover of 150, 200. I mean, you wouldn't go that low on a per cow basis in the mid-season, where you're following the rotation. So it's just really tricky on some farms to manage. I suppose on a final perspective, Joseph, we're getting very close to the chemical fertilizer closing date. As this episode goes out, we have a matter of days to spread fertilizer, and then obviously we have the opportunity to get out for a little bit longer with slurry. But if we look at the scenario where things were dry on farms and farmers might have held back spreading fertiliser, what should they do over the next couple of days in terms of getting chemical nitrogen out?
Okay, Emma-Louise. So I suppose, again, we're probably looking back to the learnings of 2018 for, some of our nitrogen advice. And okay, we got rain earlier in the back end, and nitrogen was a lot cheaper in 2018, but there was a good amount of fertilizer spread in August and early September. But what did we see of that? We saw that growth rates, even though they recovered, still only recovered to average. And we also saw an awful lot more nitrate in our estuaries and in our waterways throughout the back end of the summer, or the back end, the autumn in 2018. So it's important to be responsible with the nitrogen that is put out. But look, I suppose cost is going to drive a little bit more of that responsibility. But we just need to be judicial with the amount of N that's spread. Okay, so if we look, Emma-Louise, at the nitrogen response, there was some work done kind of based out of Johnstown Castle, but it was over four locations throughout the country. They looked at nitrogen response rates in August, early September, and early October. And what they saw was, for every kilo that's applied in early September, there's roughly a response of about 15 kilos of grass. Okay, so at current costs, Emma-Louise, if we look at urea at 980 a ton, just for example, protected urea 1,050. If I was just to take the urea there for a second, and just to do a rough calculation, 980, divided by the 460 kilos of nitrogen that's in that ton of urea, that's giving you a cost of about €2.13 per kilo of nitrogen. Okay, so if we were just say, for instance, to apply 30 kilos of nitrogen, just for the sake of that, that's working out at 30 kilos by €2.13. It's about €64 per hectare that it's costing us at the minute. Now, that's not including any cost to spread. Another thing to factor in there is CAN is over €3 a kilo at the minute. So that's €92 per hectare. So that is extremely expensive to be spreading this back end. But if we look at then the return, what are we getting? Normally, autumn grass would be worth somewhere around 11 cent a kilo to us. But I suppose this year with the higher costs, and that's really the cost of the alternatives. So the cost of the concentrate and silage, which have gone up about 40%. So the value of grass is somewhere around 15 cent a kilo. If we assume a response of around 15 kilos of grass dry matter for the fertilizer that's applied in the early mid-September period, that's 30 kilos of nitrogen multiplied by the 15.5 cent a kilo, and the 15 kilos of response. That's somewhere in around €70 where that we are getting back out of grass grown. So we've spread €64 of fertilizer to get essentially €70 of grass. So it's just a bit better than break even. Now, there obviously is benefits, especially if you're short of silage and, obviously extended days at grass. But by over applying nitrogen this back end, Emma-Louise, it's not really a huge runner. So taking the learnings from that, we've probably two categories. We've people who have been on the drier areas, the people who maybe have been growing 20 or 30 kilos all along, but have been following the cows, but getting lower growth rates. On these farms, Emma-Louise, I'd say the game is nearly up. There should be enough of nitrogen there in the background to bring these farms throughout the autumn. Maybe farms that have got rain and haven't spread any nitrogen in 4 or 5 weeks, I suppose the argument there would be to spread somewhere in around 20 to 23 units, or somewhere in around half a bag urea to some, or protected urea to that extent, but no more, Emma-Louise.
And you talk about background nitrogen, Joseph. I mean, just to give us a little bit of insight into mineralisation, I understand it is higher in the autumn time, but on that, what sort of level of background nitrogen do we expect per day from mineralisation?
So coming out of the dry spell now, Emma-Louise, and getting rain, we should get mineralization from the soil. So that is the release of the fertilizer that's there, okay, from previous applications, but also from animals returning urine and dung to the soil. So they're returning organic nitrogen and P and K to the soil. So roughly a figure, Emma-Louise, is somewhere in around, we can probably expect somewhere between a half and a kilo a day now for the autumn. So especially on farms, soil temperatures are probably 3 or 4 degrees ahead of where probably they'd be normally. On some farms are closer to the average, some farms are 3 or 4 degrees ahead. So I think if we get the rain, consistent rain, 10 or 15 mil over a number of weeks, we can be confident that there will be background nitrogen released and will grow grass for us without overdoing it in terms of applying huge amounts in early September.
And then finally, on a the fertilizer front, Joseph, from a slurry perspective, either slurry from the tank if it's still sitting there, or dairy washings, what sort of a rate would you recommend farmers would go with this September?
Yeah, so dairy washings especially, can after the fertilizer deadline has closed, it's a good fertilizer, to get out on recently grazed pasture after the fertilizer deadline. So again, somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 gallons is loads. And I suppose, back on the slurry point as well, Emma-Louise, is a bit like the point we mentioned earlier on the response to nitrogen. The earlier you apply that slurry in the back end, again, we have longer days, higher soil temperatures, the better. So again, applying the slurry at maybe somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 gallons, and similar enough then with the dairy washings on grazed ground. But again, the earlier in September we do it, the more grass we are going to grow from that slurry and soil water.
I've taken a lot from this conversation, Joseph, and I think every farm is individual, and The amount of rainfall is incredibly localised, but there are, I suppose, discrete pockets of the country who are flying it or suffering badly due to the level of rainfall that they've received over the last 6 to 8 weeks. You've mentioned getting out, walking the farm, assessing how much grass is there, and I think you've laid it out well in terms of feeding strategies depending on what situation you're in. We're in September now, and it feels like spring is a long time away, but you've mentioned it. It is important that there is adequate cover for next spring, so we must keep an eye on it. And the final point, I think that you've mentioned, doing that feed fodder budget early in terms of the winter fodder budget, and maybe that's something that continuously needs to be done as we potentially recover in terms of growth rate, in terms of how much we have in the yard and potentially how much we're short, and identifying alternatives early. Thank you, Joseph.
No problem at all.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Joseph Dunphy for joining me on this week's show. In order to understand the aspects of the Dairy Edge which are most appealing and beneficial to you, the listener, I would appreciate if you would give a few short minutes to complete a survey included in the show notes to give your feedback. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.